Have you ever wondered what happens when the compass that guides the human soul is broken? When the pillars of right and wrong crumble, what remains of us? Imagine a world where men no longer know the difference between good and evil, not out of ignorance, but because they have been taught that such a difference does not exist. What then becomes of humanity? This is not just a philosophical question, but a spiritual crisis that confronts us all today. It is the silent dismantling of the very essence that makes us human, the abolition of moral men. The foundation of morality, a divine order at the heart of morality, lies a truth that transcends time and culture. This truth is no mere invention of man, but a sacred law, etched upon the conscience by the hand of the divine. It is a law that whispers to every heart, calling us to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. Without this divine law, morality becomes a fragile shadow. It is like a ship without a rudder, aimlessly drifting in the stormy sea of desires and whims. The abolition of moral men means the rejection of this divine law, a tragic step into darkness. The danger of moral relativism in our age. Many proclaim that there is no absolute right or wrong, that morality is a personal choice, a social agreement, or worse, a tool of oppression. This idea seduces because it promises freedom, but it is a freedom that enslaves the soul. Without objective moral truths, what restrains the evil within us, what holds back the tide of selfishness, cruelty, and injustice? When men are no longer bound by a shared sense of right and wrong, society fractures. Laws lose their meaning, promises become hollow, and trust evaporates. In this vacuum, power replaces justice, and might becomes right. The erosion of virtue and conscience, the abolition of moral men, is not merely a philosophical abstraction. It is a living, breathing reality in the hearts of many. When virtue is dismissed as outdated and conscience silenced by convenience, the soul withers. Consider the man who no longer feels shame for wrongdoing or gratitude for goodness. He has lost his compass. Without moral men, society produces individuals who seek pleasure over purpose, dominance over dignity, and chaos over order. The sacred becomes profaned, and humanity descends into spiritual exile. The role of faith and divine law, the antidote to this darkening, is a return to faith, a faith that acknowledges a higher law than human decrees, a law that transcends nations, cultures, and time. This divine law is not arbitrary, but reveals the very nature of goodness and truth. Faith rekindles the conscience and restores the courage to live by principles that demand sacrifice and humility. It reminds us that morality is not a burden but a gift, a pathway to true freedom found only in obedience to the Creator. Morality, at its deepest level, is not something that humans create or invent according to their own desires or cultural trends. Instead, it is rooted in a universal and transcendent truth that exists beyond the fleeting currents of time and society. This truth is woven into the very fabric of existence, a moral order established by a divine intelligence that surpasses human understanding. When we speak of morality, we are referring to a set of principles that govern right and wrong, good and evil, principles that are not merely convenient agreements, but reflections of an eternal law. This law is not arbitrary, but grounded in the nature of reality itself, reflecting the character of the Creator who made all things. It calls humanity to something greater than mere survival or pleasure. It calls us to live in harmony with a sacred order that sustains both individual dignity and communal flourishing. This transcendent moral law is inscribed on the human heart in such a way that even when men attempt to deny or distort it, they find themselves unable to escape its influence. Deep within, every conscience carries a sense of obligation, a recognition that some actions are inherently right and others inherently wrong. This universal awareness is found across cultures and throughout history, suggesting that morality is not a product of social convention, but a fundamental aspect of human nature itself. It is the voice within that insists justice must be done, that truth must be honored, and that mercy must be shown. Without this inner witness, society would collapse into chaos, for laws and customs alone cannot sustain justice if they lack a moral foundation recognized by the soul. The universal nature of morality also means it transcends personal preference and cultural relativism. It does not bend according to the whims of the majority or the shifting values of the age. What is just remains just, what is good remains good, regardless of whether individuals or societies acknowledge it. This transcendent quality reveals that morality is anchored in an eternal reality, not in the mutable opinions of humanity. This reality gives moral claims their binding force, enabling them to judge human actions with true authority. When people appeal to morality, they are appealing to this higher order, a reality that calls for accountability beyond human judgment. To deny this foundation is to unravel the very meaning of morality itself. When morality is reduced to subjective feeling or cultural consensus, it loses its power to guide or restrain. It becomes a matter of convenience, susceptible to manipulation by those who seek power or pleasure at the expense of justice. The result is a world where ethical language becomes meaningless, where right and wrong are mere slogans without content. Such a world is a place of moral confusion, where the sacred dignity of human life and the bonds of community are endangered. Recognizing morality as universal and transcendent also invites a profound reverence for the source from which it springs. It is an acknowledgement that beneath the complexity of human experience lies a divine wisdom, a holy standard that calls us to reflect the goodness of the Creator in our actions. This reverence is not an antiquated notion, but a necessary foundation for a just and meaningful life. It reminds us that true morality is not imposed from outside, but discovered within, through communion with the divine order. In this way, morality becomes a pathway to spiritual fulfillment, guiding us not only in our relationships with others, but in our relationship with God. Therefore, the foundation of morality is far more than a social contract or philosophical debate. It is a sacred trust, a universal law that commands respect and obedience because it flows from the very heart of the divine. To ignore or reject this foundation is to sever ourselves from the source of true goodness, leaving humanity vulnerable to decay and destruction. It is only by embracing this transcendent moral order that men can truly live as moral beings, bearing the image of the Creator and upholding the dignity of all creation. The danger of moral relativism and subjectivism lies in their denial of absolute truths, replacing the firm ground of objective morality with shifting sands of personal preference and cultural opinion. When morality is viewed as relative, it means that what is right or wrong depends entirely on individual feelings, societal norms, or historical context rather than an unchanging standard. This approach to ethics may seem liberating at first glance because it allows for flexibility and tolerance, but it carries within it a destructive power that slowly unravels the moral fabric of society. Without a shared understanding of right and wrong rooted in something beyond ourselves, human beings lose the capacity to judge actions as truly good or evil. This loss leads to confusion, conflict, and ultimately chaos, because the very language of morality becomes hollow and loses meaning. Moral relativism undermines the authority of conscience, which is meant to serve as an inner guide by which individuals discern right from wrong. If conscience becomes nothing more than a subjective feeling or a reflection of societal approval, it ceases to be a trustworthy voice of truth. People begin to justify any behavior, no matter how harmful or unjust, by claiming that their actions are right for them or acceptable within their cultural context. This leads to a breakdown of accountability, as moral responsibility becomes optional rather than binding. In such an environment, harmful practices such as deceit, exploitation, and violence may be excused or even celebrated if they serve personal or collective interests. The result is not freedom, but a moral vacuum where selfishness and cruelty can flourish unchecked. The relativist view denies the existence of universal human dignity and shared moral duties. If moral truths are subjective, then the inherent worth of every person becomes negotiable. This opens the door to treating others as mere means to an end rather than ends in themselves. When society loses sight of an objective moral law that affirms the value of each individual, injustices multiplied, discrimination, oppression, and indifference to suffering become normalized because there is no higher standard to oppose them. The very idea of human rights, grounded in the belief that all are created with equal worth, becomes fragile or irrelevant in a relativistic framework. The consequences of moral subjectivism extend beyond individual behavior to affect the very structure of communities and nations. Laws, policies, and social contracts depend on shared moral principles to function justly. Without agreed-upon standards of justice and virtue, legal systems lose their legitimacy and social cohesion weakens. Citizens become fragmented, pursuing their own desires at the expense of the common good. The bonds of trust and mutual respect that hold communities together begin to dissolve, replaced by suspicion, hostility, and division. This disintegration of moral order creates fertile ground for tyranny, as those who seize power can manipulate morality to justify oppressive agendas under the guise of personal or cultural preference. In rejecting objective morality, relativism also challenges the existence of divine law, which many faith traditions affirm as the ultimate source of moral authority. The denial of a transcendent moral law severs humanity from the sacred foundation that gives life meaning and direction. Without recognizing that moral law is rooted in the nature of God, human beings are left to navigate ethical questions by themselves, often failing to find consistent or satisfying answers. This spiritual disconnection contributes to a widespread sense of emptiness and despair as people grasp for meaning in a world where right and wrong seem fluid and uncertain. Moral relativism and subjectivism lead humanity away from truth and toward fragmentation. They erode the moral courage necessary to stand for justice, to love sacrificially, and to live with integrity. The danger they present is not theoretical but practical and urgent. If the world is to flourish, it must reclaim the belief in objective moral truths that bind us together and guide our actions toward the good. Only then can society resist the chaos that comes when moral men no longer exist. The phrase "abolition of man" captures a chilling reality, that the destruction of moral men leads inevitably to the loss of what it means to be truly human. When moral men cease to exist, the very foundations of society and culture begin to crumble, because the virtues that uphold justice, honor, and compassion no longer hold sway. The abolition of moral men does not merely mean the absence of good people. It signifies a systemic collapse of conscience, where men become detached from the natural law that orders human relationships and society itself. This collapse paves the way for a world ruled not by righteousness, but by raw power, manipulation, and the pursuit of self-interest. As men lose their moral compass, they are stripped of their dignity and reduced to mere instruments of desire or control. no longer capable of standing for truth or resisting corruption. One of the most immediate consequences of this abolition is the erosion of virtue. Virtue qualities such as courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom is the backbone of moral men and the living expression of a well-ordered soul. When these virtues disappear, men become vulnerable to the basest impulses. Without virtue, honor is disregarded, and men no longer value truthfulness or integrity. This deterioration leads to a culture where deceit and betrayal become commonplace, where promises are broken and loyalty is abandoned. The absence of virtue also results in the decline of self-discipline, allowing unchecked appetites and passions to govern behavior. Society then becomes a place where selfishness and indulgence are celebrated, while sacrifice and responsibility are scorned. The abolition of moral men also undermines the social order by breaking down the bonds of trust and mutual respect. Relationships between individuals, families, and communities depend on a shared commitment to ethical standards and the common good. When moral men vanish, these commitments weaken, trust is replaced by suspicion, and respect is supplanted by exploitation. The solidarity that holds communities together fractures, leaving behind isolation and alienation. This social disintegration makes it easier for divisions based on fear, prejudice, or greed to fester, fueling conflict and discord. In the absence of moral guidance, justice becomes a mere tool for those in power, rather than a universal principle to protect the weak and uphold fairness. The abolition of moral men has profound implications for leadership and governance. When rulers and leaders are not grounded in moral principles, they become tyrants who impose their will without regard for justice or mercy. Without moral men to hold power accountable, corruption spreads unchecked, and oppression becomes institutionalized. The machinery of the state can be turned into an instrument of coercion and control, where law serves the interests of a few rather than the rights of all. This tyranny is not always overt. Often it is masked by rhetoric promising security, progress, or equality, while quietly eroding freedom and conscience. The moral vacuum created by the abolition of men allows such forces to thrive. Spiritually, the abolition of moral men signifies a profound estrangement from the divine. Moral men bear the image of the Creator by reflecting the divine order in their lives. When morality is abolished, humanity's connection to God and the sacred is severed, leaving souls in darkness and despair. This spiritual void cannot be filled by material success, technology, or political ideology. It leads instead to nihilism, cynicism, and a loss of hope. The heart that once beat with faith and love grows cold, and the human spirit drifts into a wilderness of meaninglessness. Ultimately, the abolition of moral men threatens not only the present but the future. It places humanity on a path toward self-destruction, as the loss of conscience and virtue unravels every institution that sustains life and civilization. Without moral men to bear witness to truth and goodness, the world becomes a bleak landscape of conflict, domination, and despair. Yet, the warning of this abolition is also an urgent call to restore what has been lost, to cultivate men of conscience, courage, and virtue who can stand as guardians of the moral order and bear the image of the divine in a troubled world. Education holds a unique and profound responsibility in shaping the moral character of individuals and, by extension, the health of society itself. It is not merely the transmission of facts or the development of skills, but the cultivation of the whole person, mind, heart, and soul. When moral men are endangered, it is often because education has lost sight of its true purpose: to nurture a deep awareness of right and wrong, to inspire a love of virtue, and to awaken a reverence for the transcendent moral law that governs human life. Education, therefore, must go beyond technical instruction and engage with the eternal truths that anchor morality, enabling young minds to grasp the difference between what is good and what is merely convenient or popular. Without this foundation, education risks becoming a tool for indoctrination into relativism and subjectivism, contributing to the very abolition of moral men it ought to prevent. The role of education in preserving moral values begins with teaching students to recognize and respect the universal moral law. This law is the standard by which human actions are judged, a law not created by human authorities but discovered through reason, conscience, and spiritual insight. When education ignores this law or treats morality as merely a matter of personal choice, it leaves students adrift, vulnerable to the influence of transient cultural trends and selfish desires. True education calls students to look beyond themselves, to understand that their actions affect others, and that they bear responsibilities that transcend individual preferences. It encourages the formation of conscience as an inner voice aligned with the divine order, empowering students to make decisions that honor truth, justice, and love, even when such choices are difficult or unpopular. Education must actively cultivate virtue, which is the living expression of moral knowledge. Knowledge alone is insufficient. It must be accompanied by the practice of courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. These virtues form the character of moral men and enable them to resist temptation, endure trials, and act for the common good. Schools and educators have the sacred task of providing environments where virtues are taught, modeled, and rewarded. This involves not only formal lessons, but also the example set by teachers, the ethos of the institution, and the opportunities for students to exercise moral decision-making in real life. When education fosters virtue, it prepares students to become leaders who can uphold justice and compassion, rather than agents of moral confusion and decay. Another critical aspect of education's role is to nurture a sense of the sacred and the divine in students' lives. Morality is rooted in a transcendent source, and education must open the door to that spiritual dimension. This does not mean indoctrination into a particular creed, but rather encouraging an openness to the mystery of God, the recognition of human dignity as created in the divine image, and a humble acceptance of moral laws that originate beyond human will. Such spiritual formation strengthens the moral resolve of individuals and guards against the temptation to reduce morality to mere social utility or personal desire. Education that embraces the spiritual reality equips students with a deeper motivation to live morally, not out of fear of punishment or desire for reward, but out of love for the good and reverence for the divine. Education plays a decisive role in shaping the future of society by passing on moral heritage from one generation to the next. The continuity of civilization depends on this transmission of values, principles, and wisdom that have been tested by time. When moral education is neglected or corrupted, society risks losing its moorings and drifting into moral chaos. But when education is faithful to its true calling, it forms moral men who become the pillars of families, communities, and nations. These men embody the virtues and principles that uphold human dignity and foster peace, justice, and flourishing. Therefore, education is not merely preparation for a career or citizenship, but a sacred trust to guard and pass on the moral order that sustains life itself. In a world where moral men seem to be vanishing, the call to moral courage and responsibility becomes ever more urgent and indispensable. Moral courage is the strength to stand firm in the truth, to uphold what is right even when it is unpopular, difficult, or dangerous. It is the refusal to compromise one's conscience for convenience, social approval, or personal gain. This courage is not born from pride or stubbornness, but from a deep-rooted conviction that some things matter more than comfort or safety, that there is a higher law governing human life, and it must be obeyed regardless of cost. Moral courage is what transforms passive observers into active defenders of justice, virtue, and truth, making them beacons of hope in times of darkness and moral confusion. Without such courage, the abolition of moral men is inevitable, because truth and goodness require defenders who are willing to endure hardship and opposition for their sake. Alongside courage comes responsibility, the recognition that each person bears a duty to live morally and to influence the world positively. Moral responsibility is not optional, it is a divine mandate rooted in the very nature of human dignity. Every individual is entrusted with a conscience that demands action to resist evil, to protect the vulnerable, and to promote what is right. This responsibility extends beyond private morality to public life. It calls for individuals to speak out against injustice, to reject corruption, and to build communities grounded in virtue and compassion. When moral men refuse this responsibility, the fabric of society weakens, and the forces of chaos and tyranny gain ground. Responsibility means accepting that one's choices ripple beyond oneself, shaping families, neighborhoods, nations, and even the spiritual destiny of humanity. Moral courage and responsibility are deeply connected to faith and trust in the divine order. They arise not merely from human resolve, but from a relationship with the sacred, from the conviction that obedience to moral law aligns one with the will of God. This spiritual foundation provides strength and hope, enabling men to stand even when isolated or persecuted. It also instills humility, recognizing that moral courage is not about self-righteousness, but about faithful service to a higher cause. Such courage is patient and persistent, knowing that the ultimate victory belongs not to those who wield power unjustly, but to those who remain faithful to truth and goodness. In this way, moral men become instruments of divine justice and mercy in a broken world. The call to moral courage also demands vigilance against the subtle ways society erodes virtue. It requires awareness of the cultural pressures that encourage compromise, silence, or apathy. The soft tyranny of popular opinion, the allure of materialism, and the seductive voice of relativism all conspire to dull moral resolve. Therefore, moral men must cultivate inner discipline and spiritual strength through prayer, reflection, and community support. They must educate themselves and others, build networks of accountability, and encourage one another in the pursuit of holiness and justice. The task is not easy, but it is essential for the preservation of what is good and true. The call to moral courage and responsibility is a summons to reclaim the soul of humanity. It invites men to rise above fear and complacency, to live boldly according to eternal principles, and to become the living witnesses of the moral order in a world desperately in need of light. The future of society, the health of families, and the destiny of nations depend on those who hear this call and answer it with unwavering faith and fearless action. The abolition of moral men is not inevitable. It can be resisted and reversed by those willing to stand firm as guardians of truth, justice, and love.